We've been working on a new code for the North Village for some time now, and we're doing that because the existing code is very difficult to understand. I don't think anybody's been happy with the product that it's created, and it's very hard to enforce, it's very difficult to interpret, and it takes a lot of staff time to go through. So we've hired Somas to help us in this process. What we've currently got is a code that's kind of a hybrid. On one extreme, you've got what's referred to as the Euclidean code, which is named after Euclid, Ohio, which was the first city to win a Supreme Court ruling against a developer to uphold zoning. So Euclidean zoning is the zoning that we've had since that time, where it relegates, a certain lot size, certain setbacks, roof pitches, materials, very regimented, and separates uses. What we're probably heading with the North Village Code is kind of a hybrid where, the new code you hear about from everyone is a form-based code. And a form-based code is more visual at creating or showing what you want to have. So it uses a lot of pictures to show architecture, pictures to show streetscapes. And I think what we're going to get out of this code is somewhere in the middle, somewhat Euclidean with some guidelines, and then a lot of architectural and streetscape guidelines that are more visual, so that the developer understands where we're heading, and we can look and point to a graphic and say, here's what we want, not something that's regulated by roof pitch and materials so much. So with that, what Somas is going to go over today is the process. I think Greg, you're going to do this as the process, and then some of the architectural elements that we're wanting to get some guidance from the council on. We've been to the Planning Commission at the last meeting last Thursday, and before we move further in the code, we wanted to get some guidance from the council.
What was the Planning Commission's response to this?
They recommended to forward this to the council, and they felt like they were fine with the process that was outlined. They were also, there were comments on the architecture, and they felt like we do need to have a theme out there, and we discussed that before. We want to have a theme, and what that theme ends up being, I don't know. There were comments about having it some type of farm theme versus rustic type theme. So I don't know that they came out and said, here's exactly what we want, but there was no negative responses from the pictures that were shown. Is that fair?
Yep.
Is that what you did several months ago when you showed the pictures and people were voting? Is
that was the preference survey. So what we did the other night was we showed.
Well, this is several months ago.
Right. So we were here just last week with the Planning Commission. I'm Greg Haas with Somas. Thanks for I appreciate your time, council members. So we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about this process and talk about the architecture. Show you what we discussed the other night with the Planning Commission. So this process has been difficult to navigate because many of the landowners and developers have felt like it's so heavily loaded that they've got to go and execute engineering drawings right up front, come forward with an application, and then you're very quickly into spending a lot of money before you can make changes and alterations in your plans. You've already spent a lot of money. So this attempt to reorganize the process is so that they can bring information periodically forward to you and get decisions and feedback in order for them to make better decisions and spend the money when they should be spending it. We've taken the requirements from your existing code and basically just moved things around and brought things forward when it makes sense to address the county's needs, and when we can push things back and maybe have them hold back and not have to provide heavy engineering drawings so quickly in the process. So ideally, they would come forward and they would meet with DRC, determine how they navigate through this process. And this is kind of just an overall slide, and I'm going to dive into each one of these boxes in more detail here in a second, but they would come forward and go through this master plan and development feasibility step. Then they would go forward with the preliminary plan. If it's determined at that point, what I mean is this preliminary meeting with DRC, that their project is so small that they do both of these at the same time, they can. So if you've got a 3-acre piece, you're going to do all of the information for both of these steps right up front, and then they would move forward. But we're not skipping any steps. We would maybe consider combining the two. Then they would go to final plat. They would go, and after final plat, they would have a site development plan, and then they would go forward with building permits. So this first step, this master development plan, essentially contains the elements that a developer would normally go through to determine whether they're going to buy the property or not. We're not anticipating this is anything onerous or difficult for them to provide, but it's the things that they would already have done to make the decision to move forward with the property. This includes a constraints analysis. The constraints analysis was buried deeper. We want to bring that forward so we understand what the ground is saying, what's happening on the ground. They do a soils analysis at reconnaissance level. They understand where there might be some trouble. They would provide a water and sewer feasibility report. We want to make sure that you can service it. They would provide a transit plan, which would give you a sense where in general relationship on the land is the intensity. You want to be able to get an understanding. If they're right on Highway 40, that's probably where the most intense development needs to be, and so you get a glimpse of where those land uses lie. They would do a preliminary circulation plan. Again, we're on slope. We want to make sure the roads work right up front. And so they would be providing centerline and profile studies for the roads, for the main backbone roads. They would be bringing forward street sections, a traffic study, an open space plan, and at that point they would bring forward precedent images of architecture, so that we know right out of the gate they're willing to comply with the architectural theme that we're going to establish for the North Village. They would meet with staff, and they would also meet with a new position, an architect or consultant review position, to make sure that they're complying with the architectural guidelines that would be included in the code. Then they would come forward to planning commission hearing, and they would receive a recommendation. Then they would come forward to this body for a public hearing and either be denied or recommended for approval. It would be approved by this body.
That's preliminary.
This is the master plan. Master plan.
Does the planning commission require, is that a public hearing?
It's a public hearing. And following the master plan, they would move right into what we're calling the preliminary plan. And these are elements that are already required in your Title 16, 2710, and this is the list. They would provide a layout plan. They would provide a utility plan. They would be bringing forward grading and drainage analysis. They would be showing a schematic landscape and irrigation plan for the common areas, a circulation plan for the more internal streets. They would be seeing at this level with the layout plan. And again, a little bit more detail on the architecture in terms of structures, light fixtures, site furniture, that kind of thing. And then I forgot to add that, Doug. There's the development agreement that would come with the master plan level. So this step with the preliminary plan, they would be augmenting that development agreement at that point. Following, they would bring that to staff to review, and again, this architect or consultant would review it for design compliance, and then they would go forward to planning commission hearing and recommendation, and then to this body for approval or denial. Follow me? Okay. Then the plat, the final plat, we're not changing anything. It's exactly the process you have on your books right now. They would go through and bring forward full engineering and improvement drawings. They would have a site development plan, they would bring it to forward staff for recommendation, they would go to planning commission, and then they would be provided a recorded plat.
Final plat doesn't come.
The final plat does not have to come before you. Now, depending on whether it's multifamily or non-residential, they would either, if it's a multifamily unit, they would go and do a site development plan. If it's single family, then they could proceed right to building permit. And again, the site development plan is exactly what's in your code currently. We would just take that language and move it forward. They would go through staff and this architect to make sure that we're complying with the architectural standards. And then they would go to planning commission for approval. And then we just move into the building permit process. So it's really just an attempt to make it clean and move things forward and push things back to correspond with what makes sense in the development process.
What's the advantage to taking the site development plan out of the preliminary aspect of it?
The site development plan is a much
Or,
more,
I mean, if you take it out and put it after the final plat's approved.
because plats only show lots. So,
Yeah, but when you go to the planning commission,
What we're seeing with most developers now is they have no idea who's going to buy that lot or buy that commercial pad and build on it. So they don't know, they're just guessing what the architecture is going to look like. So if we put that after the plat recording and they have to come back for site plan approval, then they've recorded the plat, they can sell the property. The end user is the one coming in for the application, and hopefully at that time,
when we get the final plat, we give entitlement to that. And they got some entitlement on that parcel of ground. What teeth do we have on this site development plan to hold them?
What we'd have to do is the development agreement would have to specify number of ERUs and architecture that's in compliance with the precedence pictures that they submitted. So whoever comes in for that site plan approval is going to have to be in compliance with that preliminary development agreement and final development agreement.
How are we going to finalize what the architecture is going to look like out that way?
How are we going to finalize it?
Yeah, as far as what we want to see in North Village, we've got this up here where we want to preserve our rural heritage and honoring the past and the look and feel of what we want to create. So when are we going to create that, or how are we going to do that?
Well, I think it's carrying it through from the preliminary to the final site plan and making sure that whatever's proposed in any of those steps complies with the code. It's a dilemma because we sit there and we talk to a developer that, like I said, has no idea who's going to be building that building, that hotel, those townhouses, whatever it is. They have no idea. And so the only thing we can do, I think, is to make them commit to some level of quality and have that tied down in a development agreement.
That's been hard to do. That's going to be hard to do. We haven't been able to do it thus far.
It is, but I guess the other alternative is having the developer who has no idea who the end user is going to be go do architectural drawings for something that will never be built or may never be built.
So at one time we talked about having an architectural review committee and review everything and then having to go through that process. So it means, yeah, the architectural look that we're looking for, is that still kind of part of the plan?
yeah, that is part of it. So we will have an architectural section in the code.
Okay.
There will be specific standards and rules that they must follow, so that with this code, you know exactly the theme and aesthetic that we're driving for. So that as they go through the process, they're always measuring it against what's established in the code for compliance.
Great, thank you. This is a great flow chart here. Is it possible to get a copy of that?
Absolutely.
Simplifies things, and we can just look at it and know where we're at in the process. So.
And if you feel uncomfortable with any of this, let us know because
I still have a little problem with that site development plan coming after the final project. I see where you're doing it, but I think it's just going to be a nightmare to try to.
your fear is we're getting entitlement when we don't have that tied down exactly.
Right.
I honestly don't know how to resolve that unless we say provide architectural plans.
And I see your reason why, but after you get final approval, they got entitlement.
They can't pull a
change of venue.
They can't pull a building permit until they come back in for site level.
Ask for the architectural permit.
Right.
That would protect them there.
Well, that's another clarification. We discussed the architectural committee, and then we decided to go with a architect to review it. So if you'd like us to go back to a committee, we could do that. The problem we had is that it added another meeting, and if we want to do that, that's fine.
Are we voting on anything today here or just discussing? Okay.
Just the information.
Can we go back to your preliminary approval? Sorry. What's involved in the preliminary approval?
So the components of it, the layout plan,
Yeah.
utility plan, grading and drainage, schematic landscape and irrigation, circulation plan, architecture, and then addendums to the map.
How are we going to make that work with the water bill? Where we want to make sure they have the water rights, they don't necessarily have to have the plans, but they've got to prove they got the water rights to do what they
Yeah,
want.
that was in the very first step. So they have to approve that right out of the
Feasibility letter.
Well, in here, we'd also, and you're going to use our application requirements. This is a condensed version by a long shot, but this would also have the feasibility letter.
Because we can what we've done is let things go with a feasibility letter, let it go to master plan approval. And then after that, if they don't, that will give them an estimate of how much water they gotta have, or how much water they gotta have. But if they don't come up with the water or have them rights, why go on to the preliminary plan?
Well, I'm wrong. The master plan would have the feasibility letter. This would have the will serve letter.
This would have the will serve letter.
It reflect what we just did to our code.
Okay. So okay. You need to put that on.
We'll put that in there. It's not on the website.
I've got a question. Going back to what Steve's talking about, when we look at sites and we say, well, there might be a hotel site here. And I understand the concept, well, we've got to give some entitlement that can be marketed to draw a hotel and eventually do it. Should there then be some sort of a site approval process? And I bring it up not just for architectural, but in looking at what goes into a site, if you were altering how truck traffic might go in and out, or access issues, or things like that, wouldn't there be a process that you'd want to make sure that whatever they build fits the site? And you're not just saying, you're approved for this, and turn the building permit.
So I think that included in this layout plan it's more than just general law. We would look to have them provide the relationships of buildings and uses of that nature in that layout plan. Does that answer your question?
Well, not really, because if you're doing that, then you're basically asking for the same thing as architectural, because you're making decisions about something that the guy that's building it isn't there.
Yeah, this is complicated.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I know exactly where you're going.
I imagine
the
if
same
people,
comment we just heard before, that we're holding back that information.
if you had 3 different hotel chains come in, I'm sure you would have 3 different plans of how they would ingress, egress, what type of amenities and how they would be arranged. I'm sure they wouldn't be the same. So how do would it be better to have another plan in place that addresses the site-specific construction of something like that, even though it has an entitlement of ERUs, of water and other things, but then comes back with a site-specific component of how it fits into the rest of the sites.
Isn't that really what the site development plan is supposed to do anyway?
But you don't have the person developing the site there. That's the difference.
At which point? At this preliminary plan level?
Yeah.
Or
You don't have the
later on?
hoteler hotel unit
Right.
there.
Right.
After final approval, before building permit, I'm saying, does there need to be a step there that comes in and identifies how their building and site plan and everything fits into everybody else's? Because it could be a large parcel of ground, it could be it could be a big box, for instance. I don't know. And however that's put in there, there has to be a relationship with every other site there that would have to be addressed. And I'm sure every big box or every hotel is different than every other one. And so that's where I'm coming from.
I think what Mike's saying is you need to look at it globally when that first site plan comes in. If it's a big use, you need to determine where those driveways are going to be, because across the street, it may influence what happens over there. So,
Right. I mean, if it's a house, if it's a residential unit, we know they're going to have a driveway and go into a garage, and we're all good with that. But if it's a commercial use or some other type of use, we really don't know until an end user comes in and says, this is my plan of how I'm going to build this here.
I think we need to call it a final site plan plus something that looks at the whole development overall.
I'm just asking a question because I've heard that 2 or 3 times from the council of a concern that are we addressing that component?
Could we put in there before final plat, a preliminary site plan, maybe not an
Some type of concept.
defining the architecture or something like that, but just so the planning commission at least has an idea of what's going to be there and how to plan for it and how they're going to worry about the traffic flow and different things like that.
If I may, I'm Jerry Tully with Somas. It's easy to sit in the third row back and listen and take it all in, whereas Greg's thinking on his feet. I think this is the core essential conversation that we've needed in this process, because it's getting to what we've been trying to do is figure out how do we make it so you get good development by attracting developers that are investing a commensurate amount to the risk they've got exposed. At the same time, we've got the county side of what are you really promising? And I think we need to recognize the way the world works. You have a landowner that wants to sell his land based on a representation that something can be done, and that's fairly close. I can do residential, or I can, do a hotel.
I think it's easy to say they want the greatest economic return for their property.
And they want to, they want to be able to represent that fairly. And they also don't want to be confused as a landowner saying, well, I've got a hotel when, realistically, they have single family. Now, in the middle, you've got the developer, who is not the builder. So you've really got a 3-step process on the private side. You have the landowner who's trying to get out and make money. And a lot of times that land is their 401k, it's their retirement. So you want to respect that value. You got the developer who is the one that's going to risk money on the vision in the middle and then sell parcels to the builder, who is really the one that's going to pull the permit and come up with all the promises. If you force a developer through your process to promise too much too early, they're lying to you. I mean, because they're going to tell you something, but they're not building it. So what we're trying to do is come up with a code or a process that makes sure that you know everything you need to know to say yes at this point, but, and move them to the next stage without them making promises that we all know are just wasting our time because they're going to change. The analogy that I think Mike made about if you got 3 hotels, they're all going to look slightly different. You know you're getting a hotel, but you don't know what it's going to look like. Now, if all we're talking about is a plat, there's 2 types of plats in Utah. There's a subdivision plat and a condominium plat. Subdivision plat just sets out a land parcel that you have zoned for a specific use. But even the zoning isn't really attached to that parcel. You attach that secondarily. The condominium is where you're really defining a use and a space within a volume of air and land. And that's where you really need to know what the site plan says. So for multifamily, condominiums, resorts, and possibly commercial, you want to know what that land use is before you allow a condominium.